Since the federal minimum wage is not indexed to rise with inflation, states and communities are taking action. And one of those efforts happened right here in Las Cruces. As Executive Director of CAFE, Communities in Action and Faith, Sarah Nolan led the fight to raise the city's minimum wage to $10.10 an hour by 2017. Las Cruces Mayor Pro Tem and 2nd District Councilor Greg Smith supported an ordinance for a smaller minimum wage increase to $8.50 by 2016. We'll have audience questions for both of them coming up, but first we explore the opinions and facts on the minimum wage with KRWG's Simon Thompson.
This is a vote for mothers and families, and not just money.
There are going to be layoffs. There are going to be shortage of hours. They're going to be cutting workers.
Hard work deserves fair pay. What we have now is not fair. What we have now is not fair pay.
Prices will increase. Not a threat, it's just a simple business practice.
I have yet to hear a business say that they would consider cutting their profits just a little bit.
We pay them what our business can afford and still stay in business.
My job was to prosecute federal defendants, many of whom had found that selling drugs was a better way of providing for their families than working at a minimum wage job.
And this notion, as some here today propose, that greedy business owners have pots of money sitting around somewhere to offset a cost increase is simply naive and ridiculous.
We all stood up a while ago and made a pledge of allegiance. And part of those words were liberty and justice for all. When you see somebody making a profit while their employees are getting starving wages, that is not liberty and that is not justice. I hope that you take that into consideration. The situation is drastically turned against the working people, and it's time we did something about it. You can start right now.
In 1933, when Mr. Roosevelt took his seat.
The minimum wage was established in 1938 at the urging of President Franklin Roosevelt, who sent the bill to Congress with the conviction that America should be able to give, quote, all our able-bodied working men and women a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. In more recent times, the minimum wage has not been increased with inflation, and low-wage workers are frustrated. Harry Kurgans works as a sales associate at Kohl's department store.
To be told that what you're making now is enough, you're not worth any more than that, because it'll affect our profit line. It's not a great feeling.
There's a misconception that most minimum wage workers are teenagers. Kurgans is 62. And the Economic Policy Institute says 88% of workers who would benefit from a federal minimum wage increase to $10.10 an hour are at least 20 years old, and a third of them are at least 40 years old. In the wake of the Great Recession and 5 straight years of falling median US income, an increasing number of low-wage jobs are held by former members of the middle class.
If there is even a middle class anymore, I used to consider myself as a middle class. I don't anymore.
Kurgans hasn't always been a low-wage worker. Before the economy took a turn for the worse, he worked a string of salaried marketing positions between LA and Chicago.
Corporations started cutting their budgets, and the first one that was usually cut was marketing.
Out of work, luck and money, Kurgans had few other options but to move back in with his mom in Las Cruces. He's working part-time.
Having not worked for several years, I was glad to get anything, just to get back in the workforce.
Kurgans earns $8.11 an hour as a sales associate. He says an increase to $10.10 wouldn't solve all his problems, but it would go a long way in raising his standard of living.
I enjoy my work. I work just as hard as if I was making 3 times, 4 times as much. And it's hard to live on minimum wage. Minimum wage doesn't buy what it used to. It's not worth the same anymore.
When the federal government introduced the minimum wage, it was not indexed for inflation. While the cost of living has increased, the minimum wage has lost its value, buying less and less. The last time Kurgans was living at home and working a low-wage job was when he was in high school.
The job I had, I worked for $1.60 an hour. But gas cost, I think, 25 cents a gallon. I think a McDonald's hamburger was 14 or 15 cents. Things are, like I said before, minimum wage just doesn't have it's not worth what it used to be.
According to the Bureau of Labour Statistics, $1.60, the 1968 minimum wage, is equivalent to $10.94 in today's money. But some, including Las Cruces Mayor Pro Tem Greg Smith, say the city cannot withstand such a large increase over the course of a few years. Smith says the wage should be set by what works for the Las Cruces community.
2024, somewhere along in there, would be about the point at which we got to 1010.
But others argue low-wage workers shouldn't have to wait that long for the pay increase. US Commerce Department data says major employers of low-wage workers are doing well. In 2013, corporate profits were at a 85-year high. New Mexico State University professor of economics Chris Erickson.
And they're working for large corporations that have the capacity to pay higher wages, but are choosing not to.
And that leaves low-wage workers like Harry Kurgans to some extent dependent on federal safety nets like food stamps and Medicaid.
I qualify for Medicaid. I'm not proud of it.
Though Kurgans isn't on food stamps, 1 in 7 Americans are. In New Mexico, the state with the highest rate of child poverty, that figure is 1 in 5. Erickson says that includes people working as many as 40 hours a week. And he argues American taxpayers are effectively subsidizing businesses that pay low wages.
Those workers are able to accept a lower wage because they are receiving these subsidies from the government. And employers who employ minimum wage workers know that, and they adjust the wages they offer their workers accordingly. And so that becomes a subsidy not to the worker, but rather to the employer, because the employer can get away with paying less because of these subsidies their employees are receiving. So by raising the minimum wage, you make the employer pay the true costs of that worker.
Erickson says with a citywide minimum wage increase, the cost of food, goods and services is likely to go up, but not dramatically. And the other result will be a better standard of living for low-wage workers.
It is definitely a redistribution of wealth. It redistributes wealth from employers and from consumers to workers. And these are low-income workers. One could argue that a worker working full-time ought to be able to support themselves, and a higher minimum wage will make it easier for them to be able to do that.
Erickson says smaller and locally owned businesses will have far less capacity to absorb the cost of raising the minimum wage.
Oh, this is what the Lorenzo's bread looks like before.
Vince Vaccaro owns and operates Lorenzo's restaurant in Las Cruces.
I will probably cut my hours, 15 hours a week. I will let at least 4 people go in staff. And prices would definitely go up just to survive, just to keep the restaurant going.
But Erickson says while wage costs will increase, many businesses will recoup that loss through increased spending by low-income workers.
Those low-income workers tend to spend every dollar they receive, and that can increase demand in the economy and can actually lead, in some studies, has led to an increase in employment.
But Erickson notes big businesses may benefit more from that increased spending, and that worries small business owners like Vaccaro.
If mom and pops go out of business, we're going to have the homogenized city again with only chain restaurants that the money goes out of the city. I mean, it comes down to economics, but there won't be a flavor of Las Cruces anymore. You know, we'll lose places like La Posta or Double Eagle, things that make Las Cruces. When people come here, the Chocolate Lady little candy store around Macias Square. There's so much, and it's community oriented. that's what this is about. And coming in and doing a one-size-fits-all, it's going to really wipe out what Las Cruces is.
Vaccaro says most of Lorenzo's kitchen staff already earn more than the minimum wage, and servers who receive tips often do even better.
A really bad day to a really good day, probably $12 to $50 in an hour. It depends on your servers, how good they are. And my good servers get more than $2.13 an hour. My tipped employees, the majority of them make at least $5.50 an hour and up.
Servers at other restaurants, like the Game in Las Cruces, often command an even higher income.
I'm more of an upscale tip as far as my income. I do nice.
Salvatore Cabanas says he averages about $25 per hour serving tables.
On a Saturday night, I could shoot about $220 for just one shift on the evening itself.
But the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows a very different story for many servers. In 2013, the median wage for waiters and waitresses was less than $9 an hour. Cassie Colway is living this reality. She works part-time on the breakfast and lunch shift at Cracker Barrel and earns about $200 a week. That's less than what Cabanas can make in a 5-hour Saturday shift.
You make $7.50 an hour, a box of cereal is $4, and a gallon of gas is $3.39. You're working 1 hour for that.
When tipped wage workers' base wage and tips combined don't add up to the legal minimum wage, employers are federally mandated to make up the difference. But with 2 daughters at home, still in high school, Colway says she's still struggling to put food on the table or keep the car she drives to work running.
I always say that there's a difference between survival and living, and I feel like my wage allows me to survive. I have a roof over my head and I have food, but I also have food stamps.
Colway gets $300 a month in government assistance for each of her daughters. Combined with her earnings, she says they live off between $900 and $1,600 a month. Even in a good month, that leaves the single-income family living just below the poverty line. Marcy Dickerson owns the Game and a number of restaurants in Las Cruces. She says even her top-tier servers like Cabanas made a lot less when they were first hired.
When you do not have a marketable skill, then you're kind of where you're at. Hone your craft and go get a better job. And that's kind of it. It's a free market opportunity. Go forth and get a better job. If you don't want to dig ditches, or do that for a living, then go hone your craft, develop some skills that make you more marketable and worth more money.
In Oregon and California, workers collect tips on top of the regular state minimum wage. In California, that's $9 an hour. In Oregon, it's $9.10 an hour. Tipped wage workers with earnings that far exceed the minimum wage often work nights and at establishments that serve alcohol. As a mother of 2 kids still in high school, Colway says she can't justify leaving her 2 daughters alone at night.
Sometimes it's a double-edged sword because people will say, get a better job, work different hours, or you have people who work 2 jobs, 2 minimum wage jobs, and then people want to complain when there's kids who get into trouble and who aren't at home, who are home alone. So I sacrifice making more money, working different hours, because I want to be here. If I weren't here, Cassidy couldn't get to soccer practice. Caitlin couldn't get to Navigator Scouts because there would be nobody else to drive them. I don't want to leave Cassidy here responsible every night for making sure that Caitlin gets a bath and gets her homework done. And, because this is not their fault.
The problem of your children not getting the kind of care they need, and that can have social consequences later on that can be quite substantial. And by the way, I would add that those can be translated into not just social costs, but also economic costs.
Colway says her work situation is likely to improve once she finishes a master's degree, as she's working on. But that won't be for another 3 years. She says in the meantime, a minimum wage increase would really help.
It's embarrassing to be in the situation that you're in. I mean, I don't ever volunteer to take anybody's kid anywhere because I don't want to be broken down with my own, let alone somebody else's, you know. Carpools. I don't go to out-of-town games because I don't go out at night because I don't have a headlight. I don't, you know, all those things that require me to have extra money that I don't have money for.
Sarah Nolan is the Executive Director of Communities in Action and Faith, or CAFE. She says political gridlock has left Las Cruces families like the Corways facing poverty.
Governments were in such gridlock that no one was really governing.
And so began CAFE's push to raise the Las Cruces minimum wage to $10.10 by 2017. City Councillor Miguel Silva proposed a much smaller increase. The council passed the ordinance he proposed to increase the minimum wage to $8.50 by 2016 and index it to the cost of living thereafter. Silva says the CAFE proposal would make Las Cruces less competitive and less attractive to new business.
What we have to do is find what's reasonable for this community. I support raising minimum wage, but I support what's reasonable for this community, and it looks like, and again through my conversations, through the research, that $8.50 is a number that is reasonable for Las Cruces.
Division over the minimum wage runs even deeper at a federal level. Take this campaign ad for Democratic Senator Tom Udall featuring taped audio of Republican challenger Alan Way. Way proposed eliminating the minimum wage for people under 26.
Remember your first real job? Here's what multi-millionaire Alan Way thinks you're worth.
No minimum wage below the age of 27. So what if they're making $4 an hour? So what?
Way says his proposal was aimed at youth unemployment. New Mexico Senator Martin Heinrich is co-sponsoring the Fair Minimum Wage Act, a bill to raise the federal minimum wage to $10.10 an hour over 3 years. But he says pressure from communities throughout the country might be the best way to get the federal government moving on the issue.
Sometimes the leaders follow the people, and this is one of those cases.
What do we want? Fair wages. When? Now.
Las Cruces, like many cities, has a ballot initiative, a democratic mechanism enshrined in the city charter.
We have the benefit of having this extra democratic tool that says, you know, if the city government isn't doing what we think it should for the best and the common good of its people, that the citizens can petition their own city. And so we used it for the first time in, we think, about 20 years.
The process allows ordinances to be placed in front of the City Council for a yes or no vote, following signatures of support from at least 10% of registered city voters.
At the time we had 5 staff, five paid staff, and 100, almost 200 volunteers, just cycling in and out of our office day to day in those 30 days that we were collecting signatures.
Retiree and Las Cruces resident Jane Ash was one of the volunteers. She collected about 100 signatures at grocery stores, shopping centres and different churches every Sunday.
I, as an individual, wore my shoes out and my legs.
Even though Ash doesn't earn the minimum wage or depend on anybody who does, she says working to engage her community and improve the quality of life in Las Cruces is a civil responsibility.
I think this issue is much bigger than the minimum wage. It has to do with being in touch with citizens and those issues that are important to the well-being of the community.
Within the space of 30 days, CAFE says they collected more than 6,000 signatures of support for raising the minimum wage to $10.10 by 2017. Once the required amount of signatures were validated by the city clerk, the ordinance was brought to the city council for a vote with 2 choices: enact the ordinance as it's written without amendments, or reject it and let it go to the ballot for a vote by the people. But neither of those 2 things happened. While the council voted 4-3 to enact the ordinance, stopping it from going onto the ballot, the mayor and the councillors that voted for it said they were in fact against it. They went on to detail their plans and power to change the terms of the very ordinance their vote just brought into law.
They wanted to keep power in the city hall chambers and keep it out of the ballot and keep it out of the hands of voters, especially working class and low income voters, because they want to keep the power. This is about power.
According to the Ballot Initiative Strategy Center, US voters have not rejected a minimum wage hike at the ballot since 1996. Since then, many wage hikes have been approved, and City Councillor Nathan Small says Las Cruces should have had their chance to vote as well.
It seemed to me like a way specifically designed to exclude people from the process, to have less public involvement.
And people may continue to feel excluded if changes are made to the ordinance. But Las Cruces City Manager Robert Garza says vote or no vote, changes to the ordinance are allowed.
And let's say that it went that other route and the voters said, yes, we think you ought to put this ordinance in place. Well, then we have this ordinance in place. It doesn't mean that tomorrow the City Council couldn't look at that ordinance and say, can we make it better? Can we make it stronger? Can we change it somehow? Absolutely they can, because they're the legislators of Las Cruces, and that's a piece of legislation. It's their law. They can do with it as they please.
That's led many to question the Las Cruces ballot initiative's capacity to perform its intended democratic function.
This is a red flag for the undermining of democracy.
Then what's the point of a ballot initiative process if anyone can just turn around and gut it? And that's where we are right now.
Cafe wants to make sure the council cannot gut successful initiatives. Raising the minimum wage is only one of the issues Cafe is pushing to change. Paid sick leave could be its next initiative, an idea that has already been adopted in other cities. But Garza says the effectiveness of the initiative cannot be understated. He says Cafe thrust the minimum wage issue into the city's consciousness, forcing the council to consider the issue, and it was arguably the catalyst for the council's minimum wage increase to $8.50 earlier in the year.
Lots of people have maybe woken up to issues and found ways to begin to share their points of view, whether it's pro or con on an issue. I mean, it's created a great community conversation. People have talked about the issue, and I think maybe more so than a lot of other things that have happened in the last decade or longer, it's that significant.
In some states like California, state ballot initiatives cannot be repealed or even amended, not without being sent back to the voters for approval. That's not the case in Las Cruces, but it could be. Garza says that Cafe or any group or resident could petition a similar ballot initiative to amend the city charter and limit council's power to tweak ballot initiative ordinances after yes or no votes. But it would require signatures from at least 15% of registered city voters.
In the case of a charter amendment, it's not a city council vote. It goes directly to the ballot. As long as there's enough signatures, put it on the next ballot or have a special election.
But Cafe is focused on the fight at hand, defending the 1010 minimum wage ordinance. Billboards and voter education are part of that effort, and they also pledged to work on voter turnout for city council elections in 2015.
I think it's not a matter of if we're going to win, it's just when. We're going to win. And I'm just trying to figure out how and when.
The Cafe minimum wage ordinance has raised the tipped base wage in Las Cruces for the first time in 20 years. As a result, Corway says she will be able to provide more opportunities for her two daughters.
I personally know that, I'll never own a brand new car or never own a house of my own, but I'm going to make sure that the girls do. And that's the goal now, is to make it better as we go on, to kind of stop the circle of poverty.
Corway hopes city councillors don't take away her pay rise by changing the ordinance. But ultimately, the issue is about more than dollars and cents. For workers like Harry Kurgans, it's also a question of personal dignity.
I know that I am valuable where I'm at. We're all valuable at what we do. You just feel like I said, you're disposable. If I go away, they'll just hire somebody else.